Hi, before we start with the actually scripted intro that I'd planned to open the video with, I just want to preface a few things, and I didn't write a script for this part, so just bear with me. For one, I'm aware of a similarly titled video going around, and no, this is not a compilation of someone else's work. You're here to hear my dumb opinions. In fact, beyond the placements of these films on their list deciding what gets covered here, what the Crabman has to say about each of these movies is completely irrelevant to this video. After the proper intro, I don't think his name even comes up again. And for another thing, I'm not psychic and I can't see the future. This is a video where the concept got pitched to me back in, I think, June. I agreed to do it this year in July, and I actually started production on it back in late August. This has been planned for a while, and I didn't think there was ever any chance that I would get beaten to the punch in it by the man himself. And then like 4 days before I'm meant to upload this, his Muppet movie ranking comes out, I watch it, I get to the end of it, and like, huh? Excuse me? So this is probably the dumbest coincidence in the history of my channel, but yeah, this video releasing has absolutely nothing to do with his one. I don't know how he's gonna go about it, like how do you even compare half of these things? And I don't know if mine is gonna release before his, but best of luck to his sanity, I suppose. Yeah, and no hard feelings if a film you like is on this list and I end up being mean to it. Opinions are valid and so on, and I know a couple of these have their dedicated fan bases, so if you're part of any of those, let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely kind of interested to see some other viewpoints on these. So yeah, clarification's over. My opinion's not his, and this was not an attempt to align with his video. In fact, if I'd known he was making this, I probably wouldn't have even started on this. So onto the actual video now. Even if this ends up getting rendered a bit obsolete, I hope you enjoy it anyway. I'm sure that most of my regular viewers know who Schaffrillas Productions is, and that our audiences have at least some overlap. That's not speculation. YouTube Studios tells me who my audience most commonly watches over the last month, and I've seen his name crop up there more than a handful of times. Well, many of my favourite videos he's made have been ranking the films from animation studios or directors, as if you couldn't tell from how similarly my own ranking videos have been formatted. I've had YouTube countdown brain rot since my age was in the single digits. This was always going to be the kind of content I would inevitably end up making. And I find the comedic little audio clips much funnier and easier to do than the other option of making a quirky little AMV to play for each number transition. No disrespect to the people who make those, of course, they just don't tend to do as much for me. Well, one day my good friend Nemesis Bloodrick hit me up in DMs and said, hey, what if we did a thing where one of us ranks every film to place at number 1 on one of Schaff's lists, and the other tackled every film to get last place? Which I wasn't too interested in at first, but eventually I changed my mind because it sounded like it could be a fun idea, and it would be a chance for us to coordinate videos to release on the same day that aren't about Death Battle for once. As you'll have seen in the title, I've taken on the worst films while Nem gets the best ones. And that's not because I drew the short straw. I chose this for a few reasons. It means both of us are going into half our list blind, as opposed to the other option where I think I would have seen all but one of the films. It gives me a chance to experiment with a less positive video than I'd normally do, and frankly Nem suffered enough between all the garbage he's had to watch for his Hasbro and Pokemon rankings. Plus this is how I get him to watch Grand Budapest Hotel and Whisper of the Heart. It was all part of my master plan. So, what illustrious lineup have we got today? Well, I should set the ground rule that we are only counting the ones where the movies themselves are being ranked, not specific aspects like the Pixar villains. And the best of the year top 15s will not be considered because I just can't be throwing a bone apparently. This leaves me with 16 films to go over. Those being Brave for the best animated feature winners, Pocahontas for the Disney Renaissance, Rise of Skywalker as a way to amalgamate all the Star Wars lists. This was Nem's idea and it'll probably end up being one of my favourites on the list, so sure, why not. Turbo for DreamWorks, Cars 2 for Pixar, Dinosaur for Disney during the 2000s and overall, Earwig and the Witch for Studio Ghibli, Source Up 2 Wave Mania for Sony, Ralph Breaks the Internet for 2010's Disney, Ice Age Collision Course for Blue Sky, Hop for Illumination, The Hunchback of Notre Dame 2 for the Disney sequels, Bottle Rocket for Wes Anderson, Always for Steven Spielberg, Tenet for Christopher Nolan, and Happy Feet 2 for George Miller. That is the cutoff point. The George Miller ranking was the last one to release as of me recording this. I've seen in my letterbox feed that he's doing a James Cameron one, but I'm not suffering through any more bad movies for this. I don't want to watch the Piranha movies, you can't make me. What an incredible selection, I'm definitely not already regretting this. I'm also going to do this in reverse order so that it's less anticlimactic. Just remember that there's 16 films to go over in total in case you're wondering how many are left. I can only stall for so long, so let's get this over with.
That was fun! I actually enjoyed that!
So, which disaster piece are we talking about first? Well, we actually aren't, because after binging all of Wes Anderson's movies last year, I find myself agreeing with the sentiment that I don't outright dislike anything that he's made. Not even his debut before he had his visual style even remotely figured out yet. Does Bottle Rocket get lost in the shuffle when compared to his later works? Yeah, it's nowhere near as striking to look at or compelling to follow as stuff like Fantastic Mr. Fox or Grand Budapest Hotel, but I think it holds up decently for a directorial debut, and even on a rewatch I found myself having some fun with it. I'll fully admit that the story isn't the reason for that. It doesn't do anything mind-blowing to hook me, and I never got emotionally invested enough to feel all that much at the big moments like Anthony and Dignan falling out. If the movie had done more to flesh out their history and why Anthony keeps giving Dignan chances that he never really earns, it might have landed a bit better for me. I also didn't care too much for Anthony's romance subplot with Inez. Yeah, I wasn't super invested in a romance subplot. In other news, the sky is blue. But while they do have some sweet interactions, some of it is dampened by how the main thing kicking the relationship off is Anthony following her around uninvited while she's trying to work. Ultimately though, I'm not going to Bottle Rocket for a gripping story or hard-hitting emotional moments. This top placement on the list can be attributed to a few other things. For one, I generally gel with this movie's sense of humour. The deadpan sort of comedy Wes Anderson's known for has been a staple of his style since the beginning, and it landed plenty of times for me, as did all the bickering between the characters, who are another aspect of this movie that quite land for me. For as little as I cared about the relationships and all, they do all have an enjoyable rapport with each other, and I think the actors are all doing solid jobs. And finally, the two heist scenes are great. The first one where they pull it off in the least graceful way possible, then the second where every conceivable thing goes wrong while they get robbed blind by the guy hiring them is comedy gold. Easily the two best scenes in the movie for me. Bottle Rocket being part of this ranking is both a blessing and a curse because on one hand, it isn't bad. I actually quite like it, so I saved it for last on my marathon so I had something to look forward to. Unfortunately, the reasons for me liking it are very simple and I can't go on about it much longer to start getting to the ones that I don't like, which is everything else on this list. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this video, it's a recommendation to go check out Bottle Rocket to see where Wes Anderson got his start. Then maybe check out some of his other stuff if you haven't already. He's made so much great stuff over the years. Alright, I can't draw this out any longer. Time to plunge into the trenches.
Fossils. Da, da, da.
Do you guys ever have those movies where you don't like them, but you think their negative reputation is a little overblown? I was ready to have that be how I started the Cars 2 segment, but then I watched Dinosaur, and I honestly don't see where the worst Disney movie ever arguments are coming from. I agree with the sentiments that it's kinda boring and the animation's ugly, but not to such a degree where it outweighs films that actively piss me off more. Though the movie still has its baggage, particularly with its characters, I don't think most of them are all that interesting. Alador's family barely have anything to do outside of a few sparse scenes, and they all range from bland to annoying. I didn't care much about their journey led by the really embarrassing villain. Kron sucks. He has an interesting counterpoint to Alador's mentality on paper, but they don't do anything with him outside of having be a generic abrasive loser who gets really insecure when people start listening to someone else. He never really comes around to Alador's point of view to give him any kind of arc, so his unsatisfying death scene made me feel absolutely nothing. Also, the movie is not funny. Not even once. Every single one of their many attempts is white noise at best, and I found myself frequently getting really annoyed with it, particularly with a dumbass love monkey. However, I do think the movie has some redeeming elements that almost make me not dislike it. Keyword being almost. As much as I was let down when the dialogue started, the wordless opening with the egg being carried around was really tense, engaging, and beautiful. Masterfully well done. The score remained great all the way through. James Newton Howard crushed it. A lot of the live action backgrounds looked pretty good. Everything to do with the Carnotaurs was actually quite tense and provided good constant stakes to the otherwise uninvesting journey, and I did start to click with the movie's main message. Alador is not a particularly standout protagonist, but he and Kron do have a genuinely kinda compelling ideological conflict. Kron's all about survival of the fittest, let the weak die, while Alador believes that accommodation should be made to help those in less favourable positions. He gets tested on that commitment when he has to stay behind away from the pack when his friends can't keep up, but he stands his ground and does so anyway, even at the risk it brings to himself. That kindness extends to Kron's lackey Bruton, who ends up returning said kindness and saving Alador's group from the Carnotaurs after they helped him. His sacrifice was actually kinda moving. I felt more for it than I expected to. And then through the help of his friends that he'd stayed at risk to support, Alador and co were able to make it to the nesting grounds first. Even in the final Carnosaur battle, the whole pack is able to stand united and fend it off, proving Alador's viewpoint correct in how a community is stronger in numbers when everyone helps out everyone else. It's not some masterfully written emotional tour de force or anything, and doesn't have the most amazing characters to explore it with, but it was handled well enough to keep me somewhat engaged at parts, coupled with the rest of its redeeming elements, and I genuinely can't see why this would be considered the absolute worst Disney movie, and that's with me having not seen plenty of their other low points. Even in terms of just the three on this list, I think it stands out as easily the best. Definitely the worst looking of the lot though. Ugh, get it away from me.
It was bound to happen while we were in Scotland, huh?
I've warmed up to Brave a little. I remember disliking it a lot more the last time I watched it, but I also remember I finished it at like 1:30 in the morning when I was very tired, so maybe I wasn't in the right mood to be especially fair on the film. Going into it this time with an open mind, I definitely think I've been too harsh on this one in the past, and I can totally see where the appeal is for its fans. I do like the outline of the story here. Merida and her mother not listening to each other or seeing each other's points of view, only for Eleanor to get turned into a bear, so now they're forced to properly communicate with each other. Eleanor has to listen to what Merida is saying, and Merida has to put in that effort to properly interpret what her mother's trying to get across while she can't talk, ultimately resulting in the two gaining a greater mutual understanding, and Merida being allowed to find love in her own time without being betrothed. And there are plenty of scenes that I do quite like. Eleanor having to catch fish from the river as a bear, getting the taste of the wild and free life that her daughter finds so much joy in, was super charming. The speech Merida gives that Eleanor helps her with from behind the crowd was nice, and in typical Pixar fashion, the emotional climax is super effective. Merida breaking down thinking that her mother might have just turned into a bear permanently because of her actions and begging for her back undeniably works for me. So there is good stuff here. I just think the overall package of the film falls a little short of working for me, and I think that's mainly because I never quite fully clicked with the characters. I sympathize with Merida's plight and all that, but I can't say I was ever really endeared by her, sometimes even finding her a little annoying. They don't really do enough to make me understand Eleanor's point of view to get me to like her, and I wish they'd done more to establish the positive parts of the relationship so that the emotional moments feel more earned. As it is, we only really have the one flashback scene where Eleanor comforts Merida when she's frightened as a young child, which feels a bit shoehorned in at the last minute. With everything else, it's hard to feel like the two really love each other in spite of all their bickering and disagreements. Also, while I'm not a believer of the Merida should have faced serious consequences for turning her mother into a bear criticism entirely, I mean, she has to face almost losing her mother to her own actions. I imagine that'd be quite traumatizing for a youngin'. I do think she should have owned up to it earlier. Obviously, she didn't do it on purpose, she didn't know what the spell would do, and she is a child, but I think she should have come to the realization that it was her fault sooner than the very end. And the vague way she asked the witch to help change her mum, not giving any details, just makes this whole aspect of the story feel very contrived. I think my biggest issue overall though, the one thing that I really hate about this movie, is its humour. Not with Merida's dad, I actually think he's pretty funny and has some fun banter with his daughter, but everything to do with the triplets, the maid lady whose whole personality is screams a lot, and the other tribes fell completely flat to me. I can't stand a single one of those characters. Nothing they did was funny or charming in the slightest, and is probably what skews my opinion from neutral to outright negative. The movie does still have some more things I like though, so I'll go through those to end on a positive note. I think the ancient Scottish setting is kinda neat. As a Scotsman myself, of course that was going to have some level of novelty to me. Mordu isn't in the film much, but he's fairly menacing and I like his design. The opening scene's fairly solid. I really like the immediate regret Eleanor has after burning Merida's bow, and the scene of Merida shooting for her own hand, hitting those 3 bullseyes and going through an arrow with another arrow is so fucking sick. This isn't a movie that I like, but it does have plenty of good stuff that stuck out to me, and I think it was only a few tweaks away from everything coming together and clicking with me. I'd imagine the troubled production and switching of directors played a part in why it didn't turn out as well as it could. It's also the most undeserving Pixar win for Best Animated Feature in Oscar history. Even if I don't hate it, both Wreck-It Ralph and Pirates losing to this, respectfully, was a load of shite.
Done, huh?
I barely even know what to make of Tenet. I finished it mostly just feeling confused, not really caring much about anything I just saw. And yeah, Nolan makes confusing movies that play around with time? I never would have guessed from everything else I've seen from him. And while those ones could sometimes be difficult to wrap my head around, I nonetheless found them much easier to follow. The thing that sets Tenet apart from the rest of Nolan's filmography though, is that even the time gimmicks aside, they had stories and characters that I could invest myself in. I cared about Leonard Shelby getting to the bottom of his wife's murder, and so the twist at the end really hit me. I was so invested in Dom Cobb getting to see his kids again, that I breathed an audible sigh of relief when Ken Watanabe and Abby made the phone call on the plane. Oppenheimer took me a little longer to figure out, but it was nonetheless fascinating to see his own inner conflict about potentially dooming the world. In Tenet, I never felt attached to anybody. Other than Kat, it felt like nobody had any personal stakes in what was going on. Yeah, the general stakes are world-ending, but I never really felt that urgent pressure for the majority of the film. It all felt like I was watching these characters go on just another mission. Does the movie's gimmick result in some fun action and cool dramatic reveals? Oh, for sure, there were a few bits that piqued my interest, but they were too few and far between for me to say that I'm glad I saw this. I am totally content with the movie just being cool action and not much else if it's on the shorter end, but if it's gonna run for 2.5 hours, then I need a bit more than that to keep me interested. Longer movies are inherently fighting an uphill battle with me, but Nolan has worked around that before. The Dark Knight is one of my favourite movies that never bored me, and that has nearly an equal runtime. Tenet just didn't have that. It's not a frustratingly terrible movie or anything, it's just one where for the bulk of it I was either bored or confused trying to comprehend how the time reverse thing works. I see the appeal for it, maybe it's the kind of film that benefits from a rewatch, I just don't think it's for me, and I'd sooner return to anything else that Nolan's made.
I'm the spy.
When I ranked Pixar's 2000s movies, I defended Cars as a film that I still love to this day. But I said I wouldn't do the same for the second film in the trilogy because I thought it was ass. And yeah, I'm still not going to argue otherwise. It's a bad movie that's broken in both concept and execution. Going from a more grounded movie about a hotshot racer slowing down and forming relationships with people to a spy thriller is still a baffling direction to go down. Even more so is Lightning being sidelined to focus on Mater as the main lead, a character who works best in smaller doses. He didn't overstay his welcome in the first movie for me, but here he's much more prominent and much more annoying. It's frustrating how much of the movie's conflicts should be cleared up with basic communication and how dumbed down everyone is. And while I can appreciate the intended message of let your friends stay true to yourselves and don't let a fight drive a wedge between you, it is not handled in an effective way. Yes, you absolutely should behave differently in different environments. Different people will have different boundaries and social conventions will change depending on the place. If someone doesn't understand that, make an effort to help them out without being a dick about it. It leads to this being the one and only Pixar movie with an emotional climax that falls completely flat on its face because Mater realizes everyone thinks he's a dumbass is not the emotional hook they think it is. This movie is not good, I don't like it, which young me would have been devastated to hear me say. But I don't have it in me to say I outright hate it. Might be the Cars apologist in me talking again, but while this is an embarrassing misfire for Pixar that put an end to their golden streak, I think the hate for it is a bit over-exaggerated and wouldn't be nearly as vitriolic if it had come from any other studio. When separated from the Pixar brand, it's just kind of a regular bad movie that's far from the film that's bored or annoyed me the most out of what I've seen. And there are some parts that I do quite like. While Pixar isn't as ahead of the game as they once were, since this was the year that gave us Rango's more impressive photorealism and the much more beautiful colours in Kung Fu Panda 2, the animation on display here is still really nice, as is the music. We're not hitting the same peaks as the first film, but you might think in Collision of Worlds are still good in their own right. They suit the travel montage and the credits really nicely. And that's not the only plus side for the music. Michael Giacchino brings yet another banger score, with Finn's theme in particular getting stuck in my head all the time. It complements all the action scenes so damn well and actually helps me get kind of invested in some of it. On that topic, despite how big of a departure it is from the series' roots, sometimes the spy stuff is actually kinda fun. The fights I think were built around the characters' non-humanoid bodies fairly well, and some of the spy infiltration and the gadgets they used were cool. Sometimes the movie's even a little bit funny, particularly with Francesco Bernoulli, who might not be as good as Chick Hicks, but he certainly had some comparably funny lines and was a lot more prominent. I love the bickering between him and Lightning, that got a few laughs from me. And yeah, sometimes the movie is bad in a way that's so batshit insane that I can't help but enjoy it. From Mater guzzling from the fountain to the gratuitous amount of death, to Finn being incomprehensibly dense and responding to all of Mater's idiocy with, "Oh my god, he's so good, I burnt that letter," to McQueen's "You are the bomb" speech, which is the Cars equivalent of "They fly now" and how much it just takes me out. Also, to give one last unironic compliment, despite the villain's dumbass plan that somehow wasn't use your boundless wealth to make all the parts you need, I do like that it ties into them being living cars more than the first movie did. And it even results in one shocking moment of competence where they're torturing the blue guy whose name I remember. After wearing him down, they're able to notice one little slip in his eye movements when they show him the photo of Mater and figure out that it's him who has the intel. It's a surprisingly decent interrogation scene. So yeah, bad movie, but I don't have it in me to fully get on board the hate train. It did not make me unrelentingly miserable. I've seen much worse. Now let me know in the comments what ranking I should do that would let me cover Cars 3 and complete the trilogy.
You never know what someone will do under pressure.
I'd never seen either Happy Feet in full before this project. I had to watch the first one to give myself context, and yeah, it wasn't good, but it did give me nostalgic flashbacks of seeing it play on a TV with audio that I couldn't hear in a restaurant that I used to go to as a kid, so that was nice. As for its sequel, I'm in a very weird spot with it where, even though I don't outright despise it, I'd already seen a lot of the stuff that I liked beforehand. I've seen the Under Pressure scene clipped on Twitter before, and I've been memeing One in a Quillion and the Numa Numa cover for years. So watching the whole film for the first time, I ended up getting very little out of the experience since most of the parts I enjoyed were not new to me. Instead, I got to experience a story where barely anything happens, most of the attempts to break the iceberg don't really go anywhere, and almost all of the new characters are annoying. I was not captivated by the Hank Azaria Puffin, the dickhead elephant seal, or the piss-irritating child penguin characters. Young Mumble not fitting in was one of the parts of the first film I actually found myself kind of invested in. His son can take a hike and run off to the other penguin society, I don't care. It's not like the good stuff suddenly stopped existing though. I still laughed at the Numa Numa cover and the funny Krill line. In fact, I kind of enjoyed most of the scenes with a Krill. The jokes weren't particularly funny, but they were kind of charming. Also, I'd heard them described as the gay Krill from multiple sources, which I thought was a joke. No, these two bring fulfillment to each other's life, and the only reason they don't start their own swarm is because it is not biologically possible for them to breed. My god, these bitches are gay. Good for them. Their small size is also utilised quite well to show a lot of set pieces from a shrunken point of view, really making a lot of shots feel grand and overwhelmingly large. That's a point for the whole film actually. While not on the level of the first film, I did quite like some of the cinematography, and the environments are just as good looking as ever. And yeah, the Under Pressure scene was a fantastic way to bring the story to a close. The vocals are stellar, it's shot super well with everyone's dancing bringing a ton of energy to the scene, and I love how it ties pretty much all of the storylines together. Mumble and his son working together, the elephant seal repaying his life debt, Hank Azaria Puffin getting to not be the fraudulent one for once, the Krill getting to make their own big impact and serve more of a purpose than just being food, all with most of the major characters getting some screen time. It's a fantastic sequence that managed to stir up emotions in me that I didn't expect any of these movies to accomplish. With the exceptions of Colours of the Wind from Pocahontas, this is easily my favourite scene in any film on this list. Nothing else is even in its league. What an amazing closer to an otherwise mostly tedious and unfunny film. Not something I think I'll ever find myself returning to. To be fair though, based on what I'd heard, I expected much worse. The low points are far from the lowest I've ever experienced in a movie, and I can't say I hated my time with it overall. You know what I did hate though? Everything else ranked below it. Yep, now we're past the point of no return. Much sooner than I was hoping. Oh no.
Didn't wreck it, Ralph Floss. Anyways,
Ralph breaks the pre-established rules of his universe is a film that I saw in theaters around the same time as Into the Spider-Verse. Given that this was a year before I walked out of Rise of Skywalker with a positive opinion, I am glad that I don't remember how I thought those two films stacked up next to each other. I forgot how insufferable Ralph is in this. He's this annoyingly clingy man-child who's lost any and all charm that he had before, with his insecurities being so in your face that they may as well have spelled it out in impact font and overlaid it across everything. And for as much as I'd like to sympathise with Vanellope having to deal with him, she gets her game broken because she acts against the will of her player like an idiot, and then doesn't even consider the consequences to her own game of her going turbo. Hell, nobody addresses the idea that her abandoning her game could be bad for any reason other than Ralph would get lonely. I mean, how could they? We needed to make time for all the awesome companies they get to visit the websites for and Ralph's viral video success. We've gone from a loving tribute to arcade games to corporate pandering where games are barely included at all. As someone who's made videos for years and felt the effect of burnout before, Ralph churning out all these videos and getting paid a fortune immediately with no negative repercussions, not even feeling a bit tired, is not only unrealistic and relentlessly unfunny, but strikes a very personal discord with me. No, the comment scene doesn't count because not only does it not factor into anything, but there was no way they could pull it off under the restrictions of the Disney brand without being unintentionally hilarious. I laughed out loud when I got to the scene this time. All of this is in an internet world with barely more visual flair than than the fucking Emoji Movie. In fact, I'd go as far as to say I prefer that movie. The Emoji Movie is definitely worse, but it is much easier for me to laugh at how out of touch something is when it isn't mangling characters I've grown to love beyond recognition. And its messages at least don't actively contradict the rules of what came before it. How is Felix covering for Ralph in his absence? How is his game functioning without the main villain being there when that was one of the main sources of conflict in the first film? Great question, but wouldn't you rather see Wreck-It Ralph shift into a floss? It frustrates me so much more because if there's any Disney movie that legitimately had a shot of making me cry in concept, it would be this one. Growing apart from the people I care about is something I worry about more than is probably healthy. So this could have been something that really spoke to me, especially with how attached I grew to Ralph and Vanellope in the first film. Instead, we got screaming goats and too many utterances of the word e-boy. The character assassination and going against what the first film established here is barely a step up from Megamind versus the Doom Syndicate. But I guess this isn't as bad because at least this movie has a solid visually creative musical number and a few jokes that land for every several dozen attempts they take. It can be enjoyable in small scattered bursts. And even if it's something this movie on its own didn't earn, entirely being carried by the first film whose rules it's contradicting, I did feel some stuff when Ralph and Vanellope said their goodbye, and I do ultimately appreciate the message about supporting your friends in their dreams, even if it means you don't get to see them as often. While it's not devoid of fun or things to say, those elements are so few and far between while everything else is so dumbed down, obnoxious, and instantly dated that I ended up hating this way more than I remembered. Can't imagine I'll be seeking it out again anytime soon. I'll just stick with its predecessor.
Hey, I can fly!
Allow me to take you through my history with Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. I saw it in the cinema with my family and had a good time, but I couldn't help but feel like something was off when walking out of the screening at the end. Then a few months later, I asked my dad if he wanted to watch Star Wars since I felt like going through all the movies from the beginning. I'd only seen most of the previous films one time each about 5 years ago, so I wanted to refresh my memory on them. I was meaning A New Hope, but he misunderstood me since this was about the time Rise of Skywalker got released on streaming. So we sat down to watch it, and I don't think I can recall any other time when I've had to actively fight this hard to stop myself from falling asleep during a film. Unless it was from my own tiredness, which this time certainly wasn't. I said after it was over that it wasn't the kind of film I could see myself hating, and now here we are. Turns out when I'm well rested and not fighting off a nap, the issues of the film stick out to me a lot more. But to be honest, I don't think I want to focus on them. More than any other film in this ranking, the problems of Rise of Skywalker have been talked about to death in excruciating detail. Do you really need to hear any more about the awful script that feels like a fanfiction, where somehow Palpatine returns, which comes out of nowhere if you haven't played a Fortnite event, where it's too focused doubling back on the controversial previous installment but forgets to bring anything interesting in its place, where so many of the emotional beats ring hollow or feel cheap, characters get no compelling development or are sidelined super hard, there's an endless series of pointless fetch quests, nostalgia pandering, and stupid shit like the whole thing with the dagger relying on the Death Star wreckage having not moved at all. Do we really need more complaining about that? Instead, I want to go over the things I liked about the movie that stopped it from placing even lower. Some of the visuals look quite cool, nothing to the level of the prettiest stuff in Last Jedi, but there's still plenty that I liked. The crashing waves at the Death Star wreckage stand out to me, and I think they make Rey and Kylo's duel a lot more memorable. The Final Order's ships rising feels fittingly imposing, and once you get past the annoying flickering lightning gimmick, Palpatine's lair is pretty ominous. There is actually a short stretch of the film that kind of emotionally resonates with me. Chewbacca finding out about Leia's death and letting out this cry of anguish now that the last of his best friends is gone was honestly kind of heartbreaking. And it's followed on with Kylo making a switch to the light side following Rey saving his life. Not that his choice on its own is what makes me like this scene, it's more because of Han showing up. I like that a memory of his father is what represents his internal conflict here rather than Han himself showing up as a Force ghost. And echoing the bridge scene from Force Awakens, except this time Ben does come back to the light, was a really satisfying callback. Well done, movie, that's 2 entire emotional moments that land and you did not space them out at all. My main thing I got out of this movie though, I just think it's kind of funny sometimes. And occasionally, that's even on purpose. Like, I do enjoy a few of the interactions between our main cast, let me emphasize there, a few, and everything to do with Babu Frick brings me life. I love every silly little line that comes out of this guy's mouth. His reaction to Sick and Twisted 3PO was the one time I unironically laughed, and my face lit up when he appeared from the bottom of the screen in the final battle. His design and silly voice are the only sources of original trilogy charm in this film. Much like the prequels though, yeah, my biggest laughs were ironic. The lines that have been mocked and dragged through the mud have rotted my brain so thoroughly that now I can't see them without laughing. They Fly Now is a line so corny and so awful that it is looped all the way back around to being the funniest thing ever put in a Star Wars movie to me. I laughed when the Jet Trooper showed up a few scenes beforehand because I knew what was coming up soon. And I regularly crack up thinking about I'm the Spy, that shit is gold. So all in all, there are a handful of things about this movie that I quite like. It is not one of my all-time least favourite films. I still kinda hated it this time around. Every reasonable criticism that's been said about it is true. It was an awful idea to have a trilogy where a different person jumps in to make the middle part specifically. They had no plan, none of this is new. I'm still glad to have Babu Frick though, that's gotta come for something.
I'm Jack Frost, Icy!
After I rewatched the first Ice Age for my animation studio debut ranking, I swore off ever revisiting any of the sequels. Then I agreed to do this video and forgot that I'd have to rewatch Collision Course for the first time since I saw it in theaters when Obama was still in office. I dragged my friend Don into a call to watch it with me since he made me watch Continental Drift a few years ago. Even as that movie's biggest fan, he agreed this one was shit, and it made me take back every mean thing I've said about the fourth film. Just about every character here can be split into one of two categories: hiss irritating, or has so little to do that I question why they're even here. Manny spouts constant unfunny snarky one-liners and is upset that his daughter wants to leave with her new annoying boyfriend in a way that is so tired and cliche that it far eclipses how bad the overprotective father stick was in the last movie. Because at least the characters being apart meant that it wasn't as prominent there. Diego is sad because kids are afraid of him, and then at the end with absolutely zero setup, they are no longer afraid of him. His girlfriend has so little presence that I genuinely forgot she was even there for most of the runtime. Sid still got on my nerves every time he spoke, and those dumbass possums are even worse. The only main character who doesn't really fall into either camp is Buck, since he's the only one to really know what he's doing at any point, and Simon Pegg gives such a good vocal performance that I could get some enjoyment from him even when his jokes would have otherwise fell flat. But even he has some baggage because for some reason these dumbass dinosaurs are chasing him and he decides to keep that a secret. They will randomly decide to not try and get him even when none of the rest of the group is looking. They're such embarrassing non-threats, and the only value their inclusion had is that I could point at the screen whenever I recognize Stephanie Beatriz and Nick Offerman's voices. I could maybe look past some of that if the movie could at least entertain me with the jokes, and some of them definitely did, but this is very much a you took so many swings that some were bound to hit situation. For every one that landed, there were like 20 more that fell entirely flat. This is the movie that made me groan, sigh, and say I fucking hate this out loud the most in the same month where I watched Borderlands. There's so much gross out humour and stuff with no real punchline, which Don aptly described as they're just filling space with noise. And even beyond the jokes, a lot of scenes feel like filler in a way that makes it feel like the apocalyptic threat has absolutely zero urgency on top of not being engaging at pretty much any point. I guess the scratch stuff, while a very mixed bag, was sometimes entertaining with how ludicrously high in scale it got. Being in the death battle community has its benefits because it means I can laugh at the absurdity of Scrat having the means to defeat character you like in a fight. And the animation does have plenty of energy to it. But those can't save such a generic, boring, unfunny slog that doesn't feel like it has any reason to exist other than continuing a cash cow franchise. I miss Captain Guts so much, it's not fair he was taken from us too soon.
It was cool in theory, but in practice it was really boring.
One criticism I've seen of Steven Spielberg's movies is that he has a tendency to get too schmaltzy and sentimental. I've not seen the majority of his films. Maybe I've happened to dodge most of the ones that it applies to, but I've never quite understood that for any of his works that I'd previously seen. That is, until I saw Always. If a movie wants to lean into an emotional moment, that's fine with me. If I like the characters, then I'll be invested, and as long as it doesn't feel unearned, then I won't be bothered. Neither of those apply to this movie. I don't hate this film conceptually. I think it's an interesting approach to a story about grief where the bereaved are mourning the loss of someone close to them, and the ghost of the guy who died has to come to grips with the fact that his life is over, ending with both sides moving forward and leaving their old life behind. I can get behind that if the characters are likeable. They are not. Pete's death made me feel nothing because his entire character is just kind of being a jackass and he's never particularly funny. I never got invested in his romance with Dorinda because 90% of their interactions are charmless bickering. His replacement, Ted, is so flat and boring and has nothing to do outside of be the new love interest. I wanted to like Al because I love John Goodman, but outside of a few sparse moments, they never get to dive into his grief or any kind of guilt he might have about how saving his life was what got Pete killed. It's less a movie concerned with telling a compelling story about grief, more about watching the ghost of this asshole awesomely prank his grieving loved ones from the afterlife. All while he gets uncomfortably stalkery towards his former lover. He watches her sleep while she doesn't know he's there, holy mother of red flags, and gets to watch her fall in love with a new guy that reminds her of him. Someone on Letterboxd called it the phantom cuckold, and honestly that's the perfect descriptor. This is where that overly sentimental criticism comes in. There are scenes like Pete's death and his eventual speech where he says everything he wishes he said while he was alive that feel like the movie really wants me to be crying over, but I feel nothing because it feels like Pete himself doesn't even take most of what happens to him seriously and doesn't move past it in any kind of compelling way. None of the emotional moments feel earned to me because there's not a single part of this film where I care about what happens to any of the characters. And as previously established, I tend to not care very much about romances, especially not ones this boring and devoid of any chemistry. There are no characters I liked, no real hook in the plot. It's an experience I got so little out of, even less than some of the more childish ones ranked higher on the list that make more actively frustrating bad decisions. It still does have a few good effects, visual gags, and the actors deliver some pretty decent monologues, but the majority of this was either sleep-inducing, frustrating, or downright creepy. I have barely anything to say about it, and I'll probably never think about it again. At least it wasn't Ready Player One, I guess.
How many more times can I say heartwarming in this segment?
Oh my god, what to even say about Turbo? No, really, what can I say about it beyond this is really generic and boring and unfunny? Unlike a lot of people, I don't hate this movie off its premise of what if snail go fast? I hate it because it has bordering on no likeable elements. The animation's solid and there were a few sequences that caught my interest visually. I recognise a few decent attempts at jokes even if they didn't get a reaction from me. Sometimes the racing scenes could be a little enjoyable. No, that's about it in terms of what I liked. This doesn't infuriate me as much as some of what I've already talked about, but it does bore me way more. There is not a single likeable character in this entire cast, which is saying a lot because there are so fucking many of them. Turbo himself is like the bootleg version of Remy wanting to go against what's expected of his species. Except instead of having convictions he's willing to stand by or interesting conflicts with the other characters, he just wants to go really fast and that's it. The bit at the end where he's the only racer left after the crash and then gives up is the most forced bullshit emotional moment I have seen in ages. His brother's really annoying because every single line from him is just, "Oh my god, Theo, when are you gonna stop?" Until he predictably changes his mind in the last 5 minutes. I found out Paul Giamatti voices him at the start and then couldn't stop thinking about how much I wished I was watching The Holdovers instead. Michael Peña's character, despite how much I like him in other movies, was shockingly charmless. He's written to be this insufferable, annoying weirdo, and I did not give a single solitary shit about his taco stand or relationship with his brother. And all his friends and their snails are completely nothing characters that mostly feel like padding. Sam Jackson has a few entertaining deliveries for some of his lines, but otherwise not a single one of them was interesting or entertaining. And don't even get me started on the most embarrassing twist villain that I've ever seen. The twist comes out of nowhere, the guy has no charisma, and for some reason he helps Turbo get into the Indy 500 in the first place because I guess he gets off on the idea that he'll beat the snail. The scene where he starts trying to intimidate him is so pathetic. This man is such a loser that he feels the need to try and get under a snail's skin. Was he one of the people writing the comments when Ralph breaks the internet trying to hurt a fictional character's feelings? Those are similar levels of loser behaviour. The montage of Turbo going viral is also really annoying. I hear, "Whoa, that snail is fast" in my nightmares now. Every time White Shadow spoke, I wanted to curl up into a ball and cry. It feels like they really wanted him to be the thing that kids would latch onto. The movie's sense of humour is so dreadful that the one and only laugh it got from me was the heartwarming taco scene, which was definitely not intentional on their part. The final race scene, while it has some alright parts, is also so devoid of any investment that I didn't even realise they were on the last lap until after the crash. And then again, to stress, I hate that he just stops trying once his super speed is gone. Why am I still talking about this movie? Why am I giving it the time of day? There is nothing to gain. If you want to watch an actually good animated family movie about race cars, just watch Cars. Turbo is the film that people who hate Cars say that Cars is. Or if you want the animal defying expectations to pursue his passions, just watch Ratatouille. Or watch any other movie that's better than this. Trust me, you've got plenty of options. Despite what my favourite line in the film might imply, it can get much better.
will be on Twitter.
Last year, I marathoned the Disney Renaissance films, and one of the only ones that I hadn't seen before ended up being the only one I outright couldn't stand. And just my luck, it's the first one I've rewatched since. Pocahontas is a shockingly bad film for Disney to release in their prime, partly because of how it contorts this real-life horrific event to fit their family-friendly fairy tale. I don't want to speak too much on the historical inaccuracies because I'm not too knowledgeable on the actual events and I don't want to risk spreading any false information about a sensitive topic, but what I will say is that even just as a story, the approach Disney took fundamentally did not work. The part of my brain that tries to rationalize everything wants to believe that the intent was just to get across a message of how hatred, bigotry, and violence only fuels more of the same, which is a good message in a vacuum, but it is not something that should be used to try and both sides the colonization of Native Americans. There is a clear divide between who is the aggressor and who is the victim in this story, and yet it feels like they want me to think the Native Americans are in the wrong for disliking, distrusting, and fighting back against the people invading their land. The final song straight up has one of them say they're different from us, which means they can't be trusted. It's a movie that feels gross in a way unlike anything else on this list, even the stuff ranked lower. And it's not like you've got a particularly good movie even if you can separate it from that. Pocahontas and John Smith have decent enough introductory scenes, but the romance is so bland and uninvesting. Pocahontas falls for Smith because she sees him being nice to animals. Okay, that's not too bad. But then Smith, who had not shied away from his willingness to kill any natives he comes across, completely abandons that mindset because what, he finds her attractive? The only time I believe they were forming any kind of meaningful connection was during Colors of the Wind, otherwise I did not care. The animal comic reliefs are sometimes cute, but are mainly kind of annoying and feel completely at odds with the otherwise self-serious tone the rest of this Oscar bait is going for. And despite the fact that they're trying to appeal to the adults at the Academy for a Best Picture nomination, the way the final conflict was resolved so quickly and easily feels so childish and underbaked. All of the Brits who weren't just willing but actively eager to kill any of the natives they came across suddenly decide, no, we're cool actually. The only exception being Ratcliffe, the most embarrassing villain in the entire Disney canon with a shallow motivation and near zero entertainment value. Even the animation and music, which are consistent highlights across the rest of the Renaissance, are a mixed bag here. A lot of the character designs lean just enough into a more realistic look, which I say in air quotes, that they just end up being awkward and expressionless. Which is a shame because everything else, particularly the backgrounds, look great. So many shots in this film are stunning with their vibrant colours. Some of the best in Disney history. The score that Alan Menken composed is also great, and Colors of the Wind is one of my favourite songs in the Disney pantheon. It's sung beautifully, and I really like the message it gets across about being willing to embrace the non-monetary value of things, and be willing to see the viewpoints of others rather than wrongfully looking down on them and perceiving them as lesser beings. Too bad that's the exception rather than the rule. Mine, Mine, Mine is an embarrassment of a villain song, Savages has pretty visuals juxtaposed to the worst lyrics I can recall for any Disney song, everything else is forgettable and disposable. I can't stand this movie. Even removed from how tasteless it is, it's still so boring with almost all of its redeeming qualities being superficial. The only fond memory I have of this film comes from when I went to America to meet up with a group of my friends. One of them bought a Lego Disney minifigure pack for each of the 21 people there, with each pack containing one of 18 possible characters. Some fucking how there were exactly 2 Pocahontas figures in the mix, and by complete chance they went to me and the only other person from the UK that was there. That is fucked, but in the funniest way possible. If anyone who knows how to calculate statistics better than me wants to put in the comments what the odds of that were, then please do so because I am very curious.
You're not even pathetic, you're just nothing.
The Hunchback of Notre Dame is not even in the running for my favourite Disney movie, but I still love it, and I couldn't deny for a second how ambitious it was, and how it pushed what it could show while still remaining accessible to children. While it was heavily held back by the gargoyles and goofy slapstick sound effects, the highs were some of the highest the studio has ever reached. And then they shot out a direct-to-DVD sequel with absolutely none of the appeal carried over. How do you top Frollo as a villain? Someone who's so compelling for how his realistic lust makes him stand out from the rest of Disney's more cartoonish pantheon, who's willing to set an entire city ablaze to have his twisted desires fulfilled. This guy wants to steal a bell because it has some gems in it, so it's really valuable. Okay, so they saw that the obvious answer was you don't, and decided to not even try. The bell itself is such an ass MacGuffin. Did you like the messaging in in the first movie about how appearances didn't matter and how they showed it rather than told it? Well, here with this bell, they thankfully verbally spell it out, and the gems inside never shatter when it rings like they realistically should. Also, the guy has a sort of adopted daughter who he took in as an act of mercy when she was a child, and she can't disobey him because of all he's done for her, and already my patience is wearing thin. What about the rest of our merry cast? Phoebus has been made weirdly racist for some reason, not trusting the travelling circus folk because, and I quote, just look at them. He rightfully gets told off for it, but then his suspicions turn out to be completely correct in the end. What a great arc for him. Esmeralda has so little to do in this that she could be removed from the story entirely and nothing substantial would need to be changed. The two of them have a child and he's kind of annoying. Much like the gargoyles, who are even less funny than they were in the first film. And the main focus is on Quasimodo getting a girlfriend. Anyone who knows me knows that the generic love story is my favourite kind of plot to follow. Oh, and they double it up with the lie reveal trope? Ah, Disney, you sweethearts, it's not my birthday, you shouldn't have. I guess they have a few kind of sweet interactions, but I just could not bring myself to care one bit. The girl is not very interesting, and Quasi's journey in the first film had him find fulfillment without needing to be in an intimate relationship. It was about him getting to live a normal life among everyone else. His love life was never the focus. All of this is without mentioning the animation quality downgrade. Good lord. It's not the worst looking thing in a vacuum, the colours of the backgrounds are nice every once in a while, but coming off of how good the first movie looked, this is embarrassing. Any sense of grandeur is gone, everything moves in a more stilted and awkward way, and the colours are all flat now because shading has been outlawed. It looks and feels cheap, which is so jarring considering this came out only 2 years before Lion King 1.5, and that movie looks great. All in all, this isn't the #1 most annoying thing I've seen lately, but it is one of the most nothing movies I've ever seen, which is the last thing a sequel to Hunchback of all films should be. None of the jokes landed, the songs are all well sung but forgettable, the visuals are subpar, the story is generic, it's a movie with nothing to add. No point, no draw, no ambition, no bitches, you get nothing, you lose. Turns out Disney sequels can be bad, who knew? Like I said when I talked about Castle in the Sky before, I greatly fear Ghibli's copyright strike bot, so I'm afraid I'll have to keep my discussion on Earwig and the Witch brief. A shame that I don't get to talk at length about the horrendously unlikable characters with the only half-decent one barely being in the movie at all. A tragedy that I don't get to go on about how the emotional core relies on you sympathising with how this bratty child misses the people that she used to bully and manipulate to get her way. I'm truly gutted that I can't delve too much into how she learns nothing by the end and remains a brat who always gets what she wants, with the familial bond between her and the witch feeling more artificial and unearned than just about anything else I've ever seen. And then how it just ends out of nowhere with Earwig's biological mother inexplicably coming back. As much as I would love to write my thesis on its broken story, weird plasticky animation that only sometimes looks good, complete lack of the usual wonder in the fantasy elements or general charm that most Ghibli movies have, resulting in a miserable experience the likes of which I did not know they were capable of to this extent, I'm afraid that this is where I'll have to cut the segment off. I know, I was excited to talk about it too, but I'm afraid that all good things must come to an end.
This is the most obnoxious thing I've ever experienced in my life.
How interested would you guys be in seeing me rank a director's filmography? I don't mean your Nolans, Spielbergs, Tarantinos, etc. that have been done to death. I mean one even better than all of the big names. See, I was recently reminded of the masterpiece Max Keeble's Big Move by one of my Letterboxd mutuals logging it. Then I thought the director Tim Hill sounded vaguely familiar, so I took a look at his page and what a pristine lineup we have on our hands. I'm kind of morbidly curious to go through all these and see how I'd order them all. There are only 2 there that I have any kind of confidence I'd actually like, and 8 movies seems like a manageably low number. So is this something you'd want to see me do? I mean, let's face it, you're never going to sleep at night until you hear whether I prefer the Grumpy Cat Christmas movie over Alvin and the Chipmunks or not. And the best part is that this video has already had me go through what I am 99% confident is his worst film by a mile, which I have been stalling to not have to talk about. Hop is one of the most insufferable pieces of shit I've ever had to sit through. I liked it as a kid, but it held up even worse going back to it than most other childhood movies I've grown to dislike. Out of all the movies on this list, this this is the one to have the main cast that annoyed me the most. EB overstays his welcome in every scene he's in. He fucks everything up, but he never has the decency to fuck off. He's never sympathetic, and just about every line from him got on my nerves since all his awesome one-liners are delivered like he thinks he's the coolest guy in the room. His dad's a twat. For some reason, he's adamant that a chick can never be the Easter Bunny because it's a bunny's job, but then gives the role to Fred at the end immediately. Speaking of Fred, he's also devoid of anything interesting going on. He needs to get a job, but his lack of having one isn't because of any kind of sympathetic struggle. He's just lazy and weasels his way out of anything put in front of him. Maybe that'd be fine if they did anything funny with it, but they really don't. Once he does get an interview, they have the classic trope of the guy having to hold a normal conversation while he's trying to hide something else that's happening. And that could maybe be somewhat entertaining if the hijinks weren't caused by not James Corden being a nuisance on purpose. The tragic thing is that for as many swings as they take with the jokes, there were maybe 4 or 5 that I actually kinda liked and wish got to be in a better movie. I like the part where Fred hits EB with his car and then grabs a rock to finish the job. And there's this scene where Carlos is trying to insincerely console EB's dad after his son's unfortunately fake death, and he says, "He was like your son to me." Fuck, that's funny. I wish it wasn't trapped inside of Hop 2007. Everything else is a comedy void, relying on every generic annoying kids movie trope you can think of. Juvenile bullshit, characters being loud and obnoxious, and second-hand embarrassment, which is something I really struggle to sit through. When EB interrupts the kids' musical and gets it pinned on Fred, for the only time in this whole 16-film marathon, I instinctively had to look away from the screen because I could not bear to keep watching. And then the story is a series of filler and stuff that happens just because. Fred wants EB gone until he doesn't, which him saying he's the Easter Bunny doesn't fix because he has and continues to exclusively screw things up for him. The two have no kind of chemistry as friends until suddenly they do because they want you to feel bad when they think they'll have to say goodbye. They have to hide the fact that EB can talk until no they don't, until yes they do again, until no they don't, it's fine. The villain does nothing even remotely evil for 90% of the movie, until the ending where he wants to ruin Easter for everyone when previously he just wanted a more important role. Talking about this film is futile. There is nothing to be gained from the experience. If you want to watch a family-friendly movie released in 2011 about how a beloved holiday is actually a huge operation run by the iconic mascot with a large team, watch Arthur Christmas instead. That's one of my favourite films, and it has more wit, charm, and heart in a single frame than Hop can muster in its entire 100-minute runtime. I haven't seen every Illumination movie, but this is easily the bottom of their barrel from what I have watched, and I can't imagine it gets any worse than this. Yet here we still have one more to go.
Yeah, we saw surfs up too. Marge covered her eyes every time the penguins surfed.
I would like you to keep in mind what I've said about every other film on this list, and appreciate the weight it holds when I say last place was an easy decision. Surf's Up 2 Wave Mania is the worst sequel I have ever seen. Everything, and I do mean everything, is a downgrade. Cody's development learning that winning doesn't matter is completely undone, regressing him to this loser fanboy who doesn't give a shit about anyone other than his new idols which replace Big Z. Speaking of, he's not in this movie. They mention him by name in the intro and then he's just retconned out of existence. Could be seen as doing him dirty by replacing him with these 5 bland WWE stand-ins, but frankly he got off easy not having to be in this dumpster fire. The animation is also a noticeable step down despite coming out a full decade later. It didn't hit me until seeing clips of the original Surf's Up right after how much more stilted, plasticky, and less cinematic everything looked. The writing is cliche, the characters are all boring, the comedy all falls flat outside of maybe 2 or 3 decent lines between Tank and Chicken Joe. I knew about the horribly unsettling part where Vince McMahon mentions wanting to drink milk straight out of a fish, but I was still unpleasantly surprised to find out he brings it up 5 fucking times and it gets visualized. Nothing about this movie is good, and I want to talk about it so little that I'm going to do something a bit unorthodox. The best part of having to watch this for the video is that it gave me the push to finally watch the original Surf's Up for context, and I really enjoyed it, so you know what, I'm going to review that in this segment instead. After the amount of garbage I've endured in this marathon, I think I've earned that much. So if you've heard me talk about Cars before, Surf's Up hits all of the same beats I like about that one. The main character is a bit of an arrogant hotshot, he gets taken out somewhere else before a big competition to meet a legend in his field that went into hiding, and he eventually learns to be a better person, sacrificing his big win and allowing his mentor to come back out into the public eye. Very similar broad strokes, and I would personally say that I find Cars to be more effective since I connected with Lightning's character growth more than with Cody's. But Surf's Up still executes what it sets out to do quite well, and even though the two films have a comparable outline, I I do still think it approaches its story in a very different way that makes me further appreciate their coexistence. Both are about not getting too focused on just winning over everything else, but where Cars focuses on enjoying life outside of the competition, Surf's Up emphasises still getting to have fun with the game or sport you're taking part in without needing to win. I'll admit that Cody was not always a character that I enjoyed following, but his growth by the end where he throws away his win to put his own life at risk to save Joe from Tank is quite compelling. We get to see him ease up, not put all his stocks into winning and becoming famous, and grow more of a connection with Big Z, who I'd say was my favourite character. The twist with him wasn't hard to predict, though it is possible I might have subconsciously retained some spoilers, and yet he was still a really compelling mentor figure with his backstory of faking his death and disappearing because the fame and pressure got too overwhelming for him. That's a cool take on the famous old teacher archetype. Seeing Cody get him back in the water after all these years was super sweet, and the ending where everyone ditches the competition to go surf elsewhere for the fun of it was even sweeter. It also gets major style points for the documentary-like format. That typically resulted in some of the funniest jokes to me with the looser style of dialogue during the interviews and the cuts of some of the images they showed. In general, this is a fairly funny film, except when it isn't. Chicken Joe's subplot feels like the kind of thing I should find quirky and annoying, but I don't know, I kinda love how he ended up befriending the tribe that was trying to eat him. The surfing scenes are all really exciting too. The animation is really dynamic and holds up shockingly well given how early in the studio's lineup this is. It all comes together to make a film I quite enjoy. Not one that I super passionately love. I'd say I fall more in the middle ground between the two most common opinions I've seen of it, which are it's an underrated masterpiece and it's mids. I like it a lot, a shocking amount given what I had to say about the only other film Sony Animation released before this, which by the way would not have even ranked in the bottom 3 here. Surf's Up is easily the best film I've watched for this entire project, and it doesn't even count for the list. Speaking of the list, it's finally over. So, what have we learned? Well, it turns out when you pick out a selection of films where the connecting thread is they all ranked low on various lists of ascending quality, the films end up not being all that good. Who would have guessed? These were some truly tough watches, with some of them being even worse than I remembered or expected. But you know what? A lot of them were also better than I expected. Even if I still didn't like them, they had enough redeeming elements to not be completely worthless experiences. And I actually had some fun with this writing process. How editing will be when I have to sit through more footage, we'll see. But just getting to put my thoughts about these all to paper has been a fun experiment with this less positive style of movie ranking that I will probably never do again. Well, unless you guys do want me to do that Tim Hill ranking, because not gonna lie, my morbid curiosity is getting the better of me. That's another story for another time though. Let's get this video wrapped up. Go watch Nem's counterpart video to this releasing on the same day where he gets to talk about good movies. Or if you want to hear me specifically waffle about more things that I actually like, I got plenty more videos covering topics I feel much more positive and passionate about, which should be in an end card on screen. And I got plenty more that I want to make in the future, so stay tuned for those. That'll do for now. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.